All right, why don't we get started? Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole, and I'm the Continuing Education Coordinator for the Collaborative. Welcome to today's webinar, The Power of Medical Malpractice Stories to Improve Patient Safety. Please feel free to submit questions into the chat throughout the session. We will address all of the questions at the end of today's presentations during the Q&A. I would like to now introduce today's speakers, Drs. Charles Pilcher and Mark Graber. So Dr. Charles Pilcher is a retired emergency physician and ED medical director. He currently serves on the Evergreen Governing Board in Kirkland, Washington, and chairs the Quality and Safety Committee. He has served as a medical legal consultant in malpractice cases throughout his career and is the editor and publisher of a free opt-in monthly newsletter, Medical Malpractice Insights, Learning from Lawsuits. Dr. Graber is a retired nephrologist and professor emeritus of Stony Brook University in New York. With Eileen Carini, he is the co-founder of Patient Safety Awareness Week. He is the founder and president emeritus of the Society to Improve Diagnosis in Medicine and co-founder of Diagnostic Errors in Medicine Conference Series and the journal Diagnosis. He is a 2014 recipient of the John M. Eisenberg Award for Individual Achievement Advancing Patient Safety from the Joint Commission and the National Quality Forum. Thank you both so much for joining us today. And with that, I'm going to hand it off first to Dr. Graber to share his presentation with you. Oh, you're muted, Dr. Graber. Dr. Graber, you're still muted.
How are we doing now?
Excellent.
Great, thanks. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. And first of all, let me thank everybody in the collaborative for the work you do to improve quality and safety. You've done amazing things over the years, and I've been very impressed with. I go to your site not uncommonly to grab resources and tools, and would love to see CRP programs spread universally. So we share that goal. We have another thing in common, and that is the importance of shared learning. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about today from the perspective of my world, which is more focused on diagnostic errors as a specific patient safety problem. So 2 goals. I'd like to try and convince you that diagnostic errors are an important thing that you should care about. And I'd like to speak mostly to the importance of learning from error as a possible way to address the diagnostic error problem. I've been working on this for a couple of decades now. This is the nonprofit group that I founded, the Society to Improve Diagnosis in Medicine. It's kind of a mouthful like your organization is, so that's another thing we have in common. And we have a lot of tools and resources on our website as well. So I would encourage you to visit that if you'd like to see what we have. We have things for patients, for clinicians, for healthcare organizations, really a little bit of something for everybody. Tom Gallagher and I were both honored to be on a committee at the National Academy of Medicine, which was charged to compile everything that we know about diagnostic errors. And the report was published in 2015. It's over 450 pages long. So lots of content in there. Just one major conclusion from the report, and that is it is likely that most of us are going to experience at least one diagnostic error in our lifetime, sometimes with devastating consequences. A little data on how common these diagnostic errors are. Surveys of patients, depending on the age group, find that 1 in 5. If you survey elderly people, it's up to 1 in 3 will have direct experience with a medical error in themselves or a member of their immediate family. The studies that I find most impressive and credible are the ones that use standardized patients. So these are like secret shoppers that are taught to portray somebody with a common medical condition, COPD or rheumatoid arthritis or something, and they're sent out into the community, and the doctors get the diagnosis right most of the time. This was a study, 87% got it right, 13% got it wrong, and these are common classic conditions. Chart reviews done in primary care find that 1 in 20 patients in primary care will experience a diagnostic every year. And for many decades now, autopsies have been considered the gold standard, and major unexpected findings are encountered 10 to 20% of the time in autopsy studies, even today with all our modern imaging and testing that's available to us. So kind of the bottom line, if you are seeing somebody in internal medicine or pediatrics or the emergency room, the diagnostic error rate's probably 10 to 15%. In the visual specialties, so this would be pathology, dermatology, radiology, they do much better, probably 2, 3, 4, 5%. And we have almost no data at all from the various medical subspecialties. But what I'd like to point out is these are all from research studies. And in practice, we know virtually nothing. I don't know what my own rate of diagnostic errors is. There's not a single healthcare organization in the country that's measuring the rate of diagnostic error in real time. So the real rate is really unknown. We think it adds up to something like this. 1 in 10 diagnoses is probably wrong. Probably 40 to 80,000 deaths a year from diagnostic error in the United States. And a paper that will be coming out probably later this year will multiply that by 4 or 5. If you divide this by the 5,000 hospitals in the country, it means that at every hospital, there'll be 10 deaths a year from diagnostic error and people harmed every day, every week in the clinics and emergency rooms. Big problem. ECRI, a nonprofit organization that studies healthcare quality and safety, concluded that diagnostic error was the #1 patient safety concern in the US today in 2018. They reiterated that in 2019 and again in 2020. It's especially scary if you look at malpractice claims, and in large databases of claims, diagnostic errors are the most common reason that patients file a claim. They're the most catastrophic of the claims that are filed and the most costly. So a big problem, very high cost, affects a lot of people. And why do these happen? Well, diagnosis is really, really difficult. I think it's the most difficult challenge that humans face from a cognitive perspective. This is more difficult than astrophysics or spaceflight or anything else you would like to compare it to. And it has to do with the variability and the complexity that we encounter in interacting with our patients and in working in healthcare systems, which get more complex by the month. And there's extreme variability from one physician to the next, as I'm sure everybody's encountered. To add to the complexity, there are probably over 10,000 diseases, but only 700 or so will be present in the typical textbook that you would use in medical school. And most clinicians will graduate from medical school and their residency programs having seen only 300 or 400 of those personally. There are really only about 200 symptoms. So for whatever symptom you have, there's at least 50 possible diseases that might be contributing to that. Another way to look at it is that diagnosis is a process. It's a complicated process that plays out over time and in different locations with different people. This is data from Gordy Schiff, who studied 583 diagnostic error cases that he collected. And what he found is that we're not really perfect at any stage of the diagnostic process. And most of the errors are encountered at the synthesis stage, where you've gathered the data, you've collected your history, you've done your physical, you're trying to figure out what the possibilities might be, what tests to order, what consults to get. And that step is particularly error prone. Just in terms of the system errors that we encounter that contribute to diagnostic error, these are at the top of the list. And if you've been healthcare for a while, you've encountered all of these. Breakdowns in communication are the most common problem that we see. And this is true not just in diagnostic error, but throughout all the patient safety problems that have been studied. Access to care is a huge problem in terms of diagnostic error. People not seeking care in a timely manner, or they can't get an appointment when they need it. Having the appropriate expertise available, being able to see the right consultant, problems with culture, with workload, with stress, with distractions. I think everybody will have seen examples of each of these. The concept that was new to me is this one down at the bottom, normalization of deviance. So these are the examples where you have a problem in your healthcare organization with one or more of these, and we just get used to that being the case. That's just the way it is. We feel like we can't fix that because there's just too many things to fix. So we get used to suboptimal systems without addressing the problems that really do need to be addressed. And in terms of the cognitive errors, every once in a while, there's a problem with faulty knowledge. I just didn't know about that disease. More commonly, there's breakdowns in gathering the data. We missed something in the history. We didn't have enough time to gather a complete history. We misinterpret a lab result, or it's missing from the medical record. But by and large, the big problem is in the synthetic stage, the clinical reasoning step, trying to put everything together. And this is a huge topic unto itself, very interesting. It has to do with all the problems we have as humans trying to solve complicated problems. And the mistakes that doctors make in diagnosis are the exact same mistakes we all make in our everyday lives, trying to make critical decisions with insufficient data and time. It's been striking to me to contrast the situation in medicine, the complexity and the variability, with the situation in aviation. And I think Chuck will talk a little bit more about this. So if you think about aviation, and Southwest is like the best example, there's consistency of equipment. They fly the exact same plane. All the operations are standardized. The pilots are all trained to a very high level. And if one pilot is sick, you can substitute another, and you can expect them to be able to fly that plane just as well as the original pilot. And aviation has mastered the ability to learn from error, as Chuck will talk about some more. And as a result of all these things, flying is incredibly safe. Your risk of harm flying on a US aircraft today is something like 1 in 50 million, approaching 1 in 100 million. And if you contrast that to healthcare and diagnosis, it's just striking, because diagnosis is totally idiosyncratic. Every doctor has had a different experience, where they went to medical school, what cases they saw in their residency. And even from day to day, their skills may vary. And as a result of all this, there are too many errors. The risk of diagnostic error is 1 in 10, and your risk of harm from a diagnostic error is about 1 in 1,000. So dramatically different. The problem we have is that really nobody's addressing the problem of diagnostic error, even though we know so much about it. And we have this wonderful report from 2015. The hospitals are preoccupied with COVID, with staying in business, with making money. They have all sorts of concerns that can take up all their time, and they really don't need another problem that they need to start thinking about. We have a similar problem with regard to clinicians. Most clinicians have not been sued. They don't remember a major diagnostic error they've been involved with. They don't get much feedback. There's no more autopsies. So we have a problem of overconfidence on the clinician side. Most clinicians think they're doing just fine. It's kind of sad that the accreditors haven't gotten on the bandwagon with this. So there's almost nothing in the Joint Commission standards or even the patient safety standards that address diagnostic error, besides having a culture that's oriented to safety. That's a very important thing, but that's kind of a general expectations. So very little from the Joint Commission, almost nothing for CMS on diagnostic error. And patients know about diagnostic error to some extent. Many of them have encountered a diagnostic error, but they don't know what to do with that. They don't know that they can report it or how to report it. So diagnostic error is something that's in our collective blind spot. Kind of a big problem. And this is especially sad because we think diagnostic errors are actionable. And over the past decade or so, there's over 100 suggestions that have been made. Many of these are backed by evidence. And even without evidence, they're convincing. And we are pretty sure that at least some of these will have impact in terms of reducing diagnostic error if ever they were employed and implemented. But to this point in time, I would say other than a few dozen healthcare organizations that are starting to trial some of these, the vast majority of healthcare organizations are doing absolutely nothing. So we have lots of suggestions, but what's going to motivate healthcare organizations to get going? You know, we need the Joint Commission and CMS to start asking some questions about this. Somebody needs to make the business case for diagnostic quality and safety. If healthcare organizations realized this was in their financial best interest, they would certainly be a little more aggressive. What's going to motivate clinicians to change? We need some incentives for that. We need some better way for them to get feedback about the quality of their care. And what's going to motivate patients to be more engaged in healthcare or to be more proactive in talking to their healthcare organizations and telling them they need to do something? Well, every week or two, there's another celebrity that has a diagnostic error, and that gets patient attentions. That may help. There's some grassroots organizations that are coming on board, and we're especially encouraged that nurses could be an organizational entity that could help get diagnostic error more on the front burner. So it's a big problem. There's lots of harm. There's very little being done. Where are we? We're in a very bad place. We're not where we need to be. And what can we do to improve diagnostic safety? And I think the key, or certainly one of the best keys, the most actionable keys, is to start doing a better job finding diagnostic errors and learning from them. This concept of shared learning is so important. And learning is important for two reasons in this case. One is just for learning's sake per se. You know, if you find diagnostic errors, it helps us understand how they occur, how commonly they are, studying why they happen. And they're important from the organization's perspective because it identifies for them the flaws in their own system. Healthcare organizations, as you know, are not real good about learning from other organizations. They primarily depend on finding flaws in their own operations for them to act upon them. And that brings us to reason number two. Nothing motivates a healthcare organization more than finding a patient that's been harmed in their own clinics or in their own hospital or emergency department. So very important for motivating them to get on board. So how are we going to find more diagnostic errors? Well, we need to do a better job asking the clinicians. The clinicians know about these things. Most organizations don't have a good or easy pathway set up for clinician reporting. We'd like to see more of that. We need to do a better job asking the patients. They know about these as well. So we need to set up portals, or we need to be more proactive about asking instead of waiting for them to come back to us. And we need more effective ways of monitoring the diagnostic process in real time. How long does it take to make the diagnosis of disease X, Y, or Z? What is our accuracy rate of X, Y, or Z? We really don't know. So this was the mandate from the National Academy, improving the diagnostic process. It's possible, but it's a moral, professional, and public health imperative that we really need to address more effectively. And just before leaving, I'd like to point out it's not totally dismal. There are some bright spots that are encouraging. In terms of organizational learning, ARC has just finalized the plans for a common format for reporting diagnostic errors from healthcare organizations, and that's going to be activated this year. And I'm working on an interesting project with the Leapfrog Group to develop a national benchmarking program focused on diagnostic quality and safety. That'll be coming out in 23. And we are looking for healthcare organizations that would be interested to pilot test this. So if anybody out there would like to be a pilot test site for this new Leapfrog survey, please let me know. In terms of patient learning, as we mentioned, there's stories all the time in the news. Those are sad to see from that perspective, but good to see in terms of promoting awareness. And in terms of physician learning, there's more and more publications coming out all the time about diagnostic error and quality and safety, and these will help raise awareness. And we are particularly excited about the possibility of doing a better job sharing malpractice stories And to tell you more about that, I'm going to turn this over to Chuck Pilcher.
Sam?
Okay. Okay, so thank you very much, Mark. I want to put in a little bit of a plug for the Society to Improve Diagnosis in Medicine. And every fall they have what's called the DEM conference, Diagnostic Error in Medicine. And it's probably the best conference I've ever been to in terms of networking and talking to people who are really interested in the diagnostic process. It's a wide variety of people that attend it. And if you just go to improvediagnosis.org, you'll be able to find it, but I highly recommend it. And I'm also a big fan of Tom Gallagher's CRP program. I've reviewed malpractice cases for defense and plaintiff attorneys for my entire career. And about 8 years ago, in a single year, I was asked to review 4 different cases of missed spinal epidural abscess, and all of those cases were here in the state of Washington. And I looked at that and I thought, this is crazy, because I'm the only one who's learning anything from these cases. And there's stories to tell here that'll help people not make the same mistake. And these were serious cases where people were left disabled for life. So I decided that I would at least share these stories with my colleagues in my own emergency medicine group, and started a newsletter called Medical Malpractice Insights, Learning from Lawsuits. And the goal was to anonymize the stories and keep us from making the same mistakes. So you want to, next slide, please, Nicole. So you should be looking at a picture of a polar bear, right, Nicole? Oh, anyway, don't bother reading this. It's just an example of what the newsletter looks like. The goal of this project was, and still is, to educate physicians, improve patient safety, and reduce the cost and the stress of medical malpractice lawsuits. The project has grown by word of mouth, and there's now about 4,300 readers. And the goal is to prevent mistakes. There's no names, no amounts of settlements, only the learnings. That's the whole point. And I do this all in a story form. And I try to keep it light with pictures like the images of the polar bear wondering, why is this happening again? And the reason for that is, I'll mention that in the next couple of slides. So why stories? Next slide. So this one addresses the difference between telling stories versus just plain data. Dr. Livingston could probably be talking about the stories of patient harm buried in non-disclosure settlements and lawsuits. But statistical aggregation of process and outcomes data appears to have little direct effect on quality improvement. Learning is best done by analyzing individual cases. Next slide. Case stories versus statistics. Patient-specific rather than population-wide feedback is the strongest motivator for improvement. The story, not the statistic, remains the brain's preferred unit of learning and the most powerful tool of persuasion. Next slide. A single well-told story of human suffering trumps the most eloquent explanation of a large-scale trial. Stories, with their linking of the cognitive to the emotive, are often both more memorable and more persuasive. And that's from, the last two were from people from UCSF. Next slide. So stories. The Bible is generally acknowledged as the best-selling book in history, about 4 to 5 billion copies. There's 66 chapters, and every one of them, almost every one of them, is a story in some form. Almost all of history's bestsellers are stories. Don Quixote, 500 million copies. Tale of Two Cities, 200 million copies. Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter. These aren't textbooks. They aren't academic treatises or 1,500-page white papers. They're stories, and they're personal stories, stories that teach us something about ourselves, memorable stories, stories we retell to others. Stories are, well, they're why we have the saying, curling up with a good book. I haven't ever heard anybody saying they're curling up with the latest issue of New England Journal or JAMA or DMJ. By the way, next slide, Nicole, I think we should be on the red one. The only bestseller in that list of books is the 1953 Chinese Dictionary, which is just behind Don Quixote with 400 million copies. Next slide. So we do have a problem. This should be the problem slide, right, Nicole? We aren't, as Mark said, we aren't really learning anything from our worst mistakes. And our worst ones, the most egregious, are those that become lawsuits. The ones that are worst are the ones that are settled before trial. And in those situations, usually both the plaintiff and the defense agree that there was negligence and that there was damage and the two were connected. So they decide to settle these cases out of court. And that really is about 95% of every claim lawsuit that's ever settled. The problem is that all of these pretrial settlements, as opposed to verdicts, which are public, all of the pretrial settlements contain confidentiality clauses or non-disclosure clauses. And those are always interpreted, right or wrong, as being gag orders. We can't talk about it. Plaintiffs, defense, attorneys, no one. That's not necessarily the case, or else I wouldn't be publishing this newsletter. But that's the way it's interpreted. And so the learnings from these mistakes don't get transmitted. We need to become more transparent, share the stories, and learn. It's well known that malpractice claims and lawsuits have never done anything to reduce medical error. Despite what plaintiffs think and their attorneys, our legal system is just not designed to do that. It's not designed to improve patient safety. And I think that that's where transparency really is the lowest hanging fruit in the entire patient safety movement. We've got to do better. Next slide. So let's remember why patients sue. Is it about money? Is it about the need for find out what really happened, more information? Is somebody mad at the doctor and this is their way to punish that person? Teach the doctor a lesson? Not really. The common denominator is this. Next slide. So if this is the reason, the underlying reason in 90% of medical malpractice lawsuits, why people file them, why do we keep learning so little and repeat the same mistakes and cause patients harm? Like the 4 cases of spinal epidural abscess in 1 year in one state. That's crazy. When we learn nothing from another's mistake, it dishonors the patient's reason for suing. In other words, to keep this from happening to someone else. We need a system that allows for that. We keep repeating our errors because we aren't learning, and we can do better. Next slide. So where are we now? Go ahead and click that. Click through that, Nicole. You can. There should be about 5 things on there. So where are we now? We focus on system improvements that show up in insurance company summaries, patient safety seminars, and white papers. We monitor length of stay and readmissions. We work to reduce unnecessary C-sections. We improve our antibiotic stewardship and monitor the amount of opioids we prescribe. We count CAUTIs and CLABSIs and C. diff infections. And what do we get when we get all this data collected? We publish it maybe. People may read it. We get policies, procedures, academic white papers. Almost no one reads them. And certainly not busy doctors. We get a grade, maybe, some stars from CMS. Maybe we get an award from Leapfrog or Health Grades. Or we may get a traffic ticket from the Joint Commission or Department of Health, or a financial penalty from CMS or another insurer. These are helpful, but they don't really help a real doctor in real time facing a real patient with a real problem. We just are tinkering around the edges and missing a golden opportunity by not being more transparent. Go ahead, Nicole, on to the next. Okay, we should be looking here at a little coffee cup. As it says, the second time is a mistake. The first time it's a learning opportunity. We have to assure that every med mal claim or lawsuit is treated as a learning opportunity. Next. Mark and I are probably the only ones old enough to recognize this guy, but just the facts. We don't name names. We don't disclose settlement amounts. We just tell the story. Present the facts and do it anonymously. What happened, why it happened, how to assure that it won't happen again. It's what plaintiffs want. It's what we should want. Blame and shame is not the goal. It doesn't matter who made the mistake. It only matters that no one repeats the mistake, and stories are the best way to do that. Spinal epidural abscess is an easy diagnosis to make if you think about it. And this is where Mark's points about cognitive synthesis. And, we see a lot of back pain in the emergency room. Back pain is one of the most common presentations, and yet only about 1 in 5 to 10,000 cases of back pain are due to spinal epidural abscess. But if you don't think about it, you're going to miss it. And this is where cognitive synthesis comes in. But telling stories helps people remember how they could have made this same mistake. And I hear feedback from readers of this, that they, things like, I just made my first diagnosis of spinal epidural abscess. Thanks for telling me a story earlier. Next slide. Again, don't bother reading this. This is just the first page. I can't show you my pointer on this, but go on to the next page, Nicole. This is the rest of the facts part of a story. This was the story on spinal epidural abscess. And again, you don't have to read this, but if you look at it, after the facts comes a plaintiff argument, and then the defense argument, and then the result. And you notice that the result says confidential large settlement. This is because confidential is meant that the amount of the settlement and the names of those involved are not to be disclosed. But everyone considers it a gag order, so the learnings as well are lost. And in these 4 cases, no healthcare provider except for me and the defendants in the cases learned anything. So the next slide is the heart of the story. Next slide, the takeaways, the learnings. In this, you can just see how busy that slide is. There's a lot to learn from this one case. It's all the things that went wrong and led to the patient's paralysis. And unfortunately, in this particular case, this case went on for 5 years before it was finally settled confidentially. And 2 years after it settled, this patient, who was in a wheelchair and disabled and very depressed, committed suicide 2 years after the case was settled. The point is, we can learn a lot from a med mal case like this. Next slide. If other industries can do this, we can too. The automotive industry does it by reporting failures in automotive products to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Next. OSHA does it by reporting the details of industrial accidents. Next, the Consumer Product Safety Commission does it by telling stories of dangerous consumer products. And as Mark sort of alluded to, if these agencies can do it, why can't we in healthcare do the same thing? Here's some more. Next slide. We should be on the nuclear, showing a slide of the nuclear, whatever those things are, those coolers, I think they are. The nuclear and petrochemical and aviation industries are known as high reliability organizations, and their number one principle is a preoccupation with preventing failure. All of these agencies investigate errors and share the stories. When we in healthcare don't do the same, we can't even begin to think about prevention. We need to become more transparent, like these other industries. Next slide. Okay, Nicole, if you can play this, try it. I just put this in there because I love this little ad for AT&T. Some of you may have seen it, but it's always worth a second look. If it doesn't come up and doesn't work, we'll just go on to the next slide. You want to try it, Nicole?
He's okay.
Just okay?
Guess who just got reinstated?
Well, not officially. Nervous?
Yeah.
Yeah, me too. Don't worry about it. We'll figure it out.
I'll see you in there.
Just okay is not okay. AT&T.
Okay, thanks, Nicole. Go on to the next slide. Okay. The poster child for safety, as Mark alluded to, is the aviation industry. There's 4 organizations that work together to tell these stories: the NTSB, the FAA, the Aviation Safety Reporting System, ASRS, that's more for pilots and mechanics, and CAST, the Commercial Aviation Safety Team. These 4 organizations work together to create the story of a major medical or major aircraft incident. And when they get done with this, the stories are shared with every airline, every plane manufacturer, every pilot, every mechanic, anybody who needs to know what happened learns from it. So the aviation, think about this, if the aviation industry managed its plane crashes like we in healthcare manage ours, how many of us would dare get on an airplane? And the corollary to that is that if we in healthcare manage our plane crashes like the aviation industry manages theirs, we could make healthcare as safe as aviation. We could save thousands of lives every year. We could reduce the cost and stress of med mal lawsuits. We could reduce medical malpractice insurance premiums. We could even improve the profitability of medical malpractice insurance companies. Most of all, we could fulfill the wish of injured patients that this won't happen to somebody else. We just can't keep sweeping these stories of our mistakes under the rug. We've got to change, and we can. Next slide. One of the hopeful signs that I've found in the last year is the National Patient Safety Board. It's in its formative stages, but the fact is that it's modeled after the NTSB, and that's encouraging. It's easily found in npsb.org, and there's some really, next slide, Nicole. The people that are supporting that are a pretty impressive list, and I wish them well. It's worth following at npsb.org. Next slide. So you can read this for yourself. The point is, if Kim Kardashian gets it, why can't we? Next slide. So click through these one at a time, Nicole. Our worst mistakes become lawsuits. Learning from them is the quickest way to eliminate repeated errors and improve patient safety. We do that by telling the stories behind verdicts and settlements. That requires revising the the role of non-disclosure clauses. That seems to be the biggest problem. 95% of our cases are settled out of court. 95% of the time we learn nothing. And emphasizing those learnings is the quickest way to eliminate medical error. There's also other points here on on my summary. The goal of attorneys, the risk managers, and med mal insurance companies should be to work themselves out of business. And that, I mean, that's almost a joke. It's not going to happen. This is a really heavy boulder we're trying to push up a really steep hill. The longer we continue to bury the learnings from these events, the more likely we are to bury the next patient. No one wins when a provider has to say, I wish I would have known. The only right thing to do is create a system in which everyone can say, thank you for letting me know. Let's see. Okay, final slide. I think that's it. Then if anybody has any questions at the very end, there's a way to either read the archives of my newsletters, subscribe to the newsletter, or just send me an email. So thank you all very much. Thank you, Mark, for the introduction, and thank you for working together on this. It's been a pleasure. And I'd be very interested. I see Alan Lembitz is on here. Hi, Alan. Go ahead and ask a question.
Okay, well, thank you both so much. We had quite an active chat today, so I'm going to scroll back up and kind of go through some of the questions that we had come up. So good thing we have some time saved for Q&A today. So our first question came while you were speaking, Dr. Graber, and it's from Beth, and she asks, how much does the age of the patient contribute to diagnostic error? This person is old, 80 plus, and has chronic back pain before, so their complaint about a different presentation of pain does not spur additional testing. Yeah,
great question and a great topic. Elderly patients are certainly predisposed to diagnostic error for a number of reasons. They tend to be more complex medically. There's so many things going on. There are more medications. And it's interesting that an older person is less likely to have a fever for the same infection that would cause a high fever in a younger patient, for example, or they report their pain differently. So certainly they are, I think, more common in the elderly. There's very little data to compare the rate of diagnostic error in the different age groups. But if somebody ever did that study, pretty sure that's how it would turn out. You know, neonates and infants have the same problem. They can't tell us their complaint. And that's a big problem in terms of trying to figure out what's going on for them. So at both extremes, you're at risk, as is everybody in the middle.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Lori, and I know that we sent an article, but please expand on your comment about how nurses can help with diagnostic error. I think the whole group could benefit from hearing this. Yeah, this is something that's very actionable, and we could all do something about today. You remember the Thomas Duncan story? This is the first patient in the United States who had Ebola. He came to an emergency department in Texas. He had just been to West Africa, an endemic region. It was right in the middle of when the CDC was sending out alerts about watch out for Ebola patients who might come in. And he had fever, he had headache, he had vomiting. The nurse noted that he had been to an endemic region, put it in her note. The physician who saw the patient afterwards didn't ask a travel history, didn't talk to the nurse, didn't read the nurse's note, and missed the diagnosis, sent the patient home with Ebola. He exposed 24 other people before he returned to the hospital. So there's an incredibly important role that nurses can play. They need to be more involved. They need to be more engaged. They need to be more vocal, and they need to be more accepted by the physicians who are working with them. So we think this is a really important point. We'd love to see nurses more engaged, more empowered, and more welcomed. Thank you. Our next question came from Tracy, and can you speak to the cost? To patients regarding diagnostic orders, insurance companies not paying for retests, out-of-pocket costs, etc.? Yeah, you know, the harm from diagnostic error is more than physical, it's psychological, it's financial. Many patients go on these diagnostic journeys that take months or years or decades
which are very traumatic in their own right. So there's no question that the harm extends beyond just the physical damage. The cost of repeating tests can be enormous for some of these patients. So a big issue.
Okay, our next question comes from Lori. Is someone looking at how much contracted physician groups, less direct accountability to the facility, meeting daily patient volume quotas, so less time with patients, especially in the emergency department, contracted offsite radiology readers from overseas on the evening and night shifts, et cetera, are impacting misdiagnosis?
Is that about private practice groups? Was that question?
It's one about contracted physician groups,
Yeah.
the need to meet patient volumes.
Yeah, great question. And it would be a wonderful grant for somebody to write up and study that. I'd love to know the answer myself. I know some physician groups that are really safety conscious. They have conferences about patient safety. They have a wonderful culture of accountability. And I know other physician practice groups that are in the totally opposite direction. So there's no question that production pressure is bad. Lack of accountability is bad. Not following up on patients is bad. Breakdowns in continuity of care are bad. So it would be wonderful to have more data on exactly that kind of issue.
I'd like to weigh in on that. I think that one of the problems with CMGs is that physicians who go to work for a contract medical group, in general, I think are looking for a job, not a career. And that's a big difference. The only way to, you have to be involved in your group. You have to be involved in your hospital. You have to participate. And if you don't participate, you're not going to have a satisfying career. Single hospital groups are far the most engaged and most productive and happiest. And I think that's because they feel an ownership in the organization. So I would just encourage anybody who is in a CMG to make sure that you're part of the solution, not part of the just whiners.
Thank you. All right, our next question comes from Lori. Are you using trigger tools to find diagnostic errors in the emergency room?
Repeat that again, Nicole.
Are you using or are there any trigger tools to find diagnostic errors in the emergency room?
Okay, so I can tackle that one. Trigger tools are coming online just as we speak, and I think going forward we'll see more and more of them. They've been used mostly in primary care to this point, most effectively by Kaiser Permanente. Michael Cantor is at KP Southern California, set up a terrific trigger tool system to look for example, patients who have a positive fecal occult blood and haven't had a colonoscopy yet, people with sky-high PSAs who haven't been to urology. So these are very effective ways of keeping patients from falling between the cracks. And they've also been used in research a lot to try and find patients where there might have been an opportunity to have done better. For example, a patient who's seen in the emergency room for whatever the problem is, and then they're admitted a week or two later. That kind of pairing that you can discover through a trigger tool will discover an enriched population of patients who've had diagnostic errors. In other words, they could have made the diagnosis in the emergency room or expedited it, and for whatever reason, it just didn't happen. So absolutely, it's an important new tool that I think we'll be seeing more of, and it could definitely be beneficial.
Alan, I saw you had your hand raised and put some comments in the Q&A. If you want to unmute, why don't you go ahead and ask them directly?
Can you hear me then?
Yes, I can.
Great. So yeah, I obviously agree and spent my career with agreeing with the idea that we can and should learn from our med-mal claims, but I don't want to be as pessimistic for the audience that we're not doing that at all. And I give you some examples for people to look. The anesthesiologists have been sending experts around to all the different liability carriers for probably 15 years, and they publish a closed claims project with trends there and have done an amazing job. CRICO RMF is, I don't know which side of the website it is, whether it's the public facing you have to get in, has a pretty amazing closed claim summaries with commentary, similar to what the New England Journal, inside case of the month type looks. The Canadians, CMPA, have a wide open claims library. And we've been teaching in obviously, the folks from blanking, MedStar have been teaching residents and attendings using closed claims and live claims for a long time. So I don't want to leave. I wouldn't want to leave the audience with a negative view that it's been silent in the industry and that they're not doing anything. Maybe I think what this calls for is we need to do a better job of somehow publicizing these resources that are out there. That's all I would say.
Alan, thank you very much for that, because I agree. And I think the point is I would like to see more of these stories pushed out rather than just posted for passive acquisition. And I think that's what the aviation industry is doing. They push out the reports so that everybody sees them. I'm also a huge fan of the CMPA. Canada has about I think it's 25% of the incidents of malpractice claims and settlements as the United States, and the costs are a lot. Actually, their cost per case settlement, I think, is higher than ours because they only really have the most egregious errors that get that far. But CMPA has a really great, like you say, a library of resources, and they let when something goes wrong, CMPA lets everybody know about it.
Yeah, let me just add the CRICO database has been a gold mine for learning about diagnostic error. They code all the cases that come in extensively, and researchers have been able to study this very effectively. This is where we know that most diagnostic errors occur in ambulatory settings. It's from the CRICO data.
Well, I think that's a great segue into the next question, and maybe you can answer this, Dr. Pilchers. How would you recommend prioritizing the shared learnings within healthcare organizations? How does that fit in?
Prioritizing the learnings?
Sharing of the learnings within organizations.
I think the best example is that if we do something wrong at our hospital, there's another hospital about 7 miles down the road that never hears about it. They don't learn anything from us, and we don't learn anything from them. So the question is, how do we share the learnings? I think we just have to get away from the blame and shame thing, that if there is an error, we can anonymize it somehow. Well, let me give an example. Mark brought up the Ebola case. I'm really proud of one of the hospitals, you probably know it, Virginia Mason here in Seattle, that made an error in the operating room where they injected a woman with a cleaning solution rather than whatever the medication was they wanted. And within 2 or 3 days, that case, they went out publicly and put that in the media, in the newspaper, on television, and sent it around the country. And it changed operating room procedures overnight. And that's the sort of thing that I'm just extremely proud of the way they managed that. And it's an example of how we can change, improve patient safety if we're just a little more transparent.
Great. Antonio, I see you also have your hand raised. If you want to go ahead and unmute, you can ask your question directly.
Yeah, I was wondering, hi, great presentation, both of you, Mark and Chuck. In New York State, you're not allowed to talk to the people involved in a case. It's all disclosable. It's all discoverable in a lawsuit. And I'm wondering that learning from lawsuits is one thing, but so many of the QA and peer review discussions that we have about these cases either may not ever make it to lawsuits, but we're not allowed to discuss the nuance and the grittiness of a case because that could end up in court being discovered by plaintiff's lawyers. So I know that California, Florida, and New York allow no protection from any provider who was involved in a case, no matter what the setting. Does anyone know how many other states do not protect that discussion? And the point being that the CRICO databases and all those databases are great, but I think that our lack of open and honest discussion of these cases, because of the laws that allow it to be discovered, are really still hampering our understanding and our learning. And I think, Chuck, that's what you've done really well, is present that kind of detail.
I'm thinking of I think it's New Zealand, but years ago they called it hot tubbing, where if there was a mistake, the plaintiff, the defendant, their attorneys, the insurers, everybody got in a virtual hot tub, and they just all sat down in a room and talked about it until they figured out whether the claim had merit, whether there was causation, whether there was negligence, and what the damages should be. But it's a really fast way of resolving problems, and then they shared the learnings. So you know, I don't know what we're going to do about this lack of transparency, because that's what's killing us and killing patients.
I mean, we just had a pretty tough case, and the first thing everyone says is whoever was involved in the case cannot talk about it, has to leave the room.
At least after the fact, once it's settled, you should be able to push it out to anybody that wants to know.
But even then, it's years later.
Better than not at all.
No, I completely agree, but we're left with crumbs.
More questions, Nicole?
We have a very active chat full of comments that I don't think we're going to have time to read them all. We're almost at the top of the hour, so I think with that, we're going to wrap up the session. For those of you who have asked about Dr. Pilcher's newsletter, I can include a link to to how to register for that when I send out the email as a follow-up to this session. So with that, I just want to say thank you to all of you for joining us today, and a special thank you to our speakers, Dr. Pilcher and Dr. Graber, for sharing their insights and their knowledge with us today. And we hope to see you soon at our next webinar.
Thank you all very much.
Thanks, everyone.